Tansei, good day. Hello, everyone. My name is Cathy Richardson, and in this video, I'm in conversation with Dr. Allan Wade, who's going to be talking about resistance to violence, and more specifically, how women and children resist violence in the context of their homes and family life. And he'll also be speaking about the sort of intersectional realities that form the backdrop today of violence and how people experience it. So in just a moment, join me with Dr. Allan Wade. So, hi, Allan.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Good. We're back together again here. I've been working with Allan since around 2012. And yeah, response-based practice has gone through a number of, growth spurts. And I think we've arrived at some really interesting analysis these days. So as we get into that, Allan, would you like to start off talking about this idea that you coined a while back, that whenever people are mistreated, they resist in some way? And the resistance doesn't always stop the violence, due to power imbalances, but it serves to preserve the person's dignity and try to maximize safety. So for women and children who are maybe escaping violence in the home and maybe ending up in a shelter, would you like to talk a little bit about how you see that the women's resistance and maybe the children's resistance in this kind of context?
Sure. Yeah, I had been working in our field, doing counseling, therapy, whatever you want to call it, for a while, and had never occurred to me to think that people had been A, responding, or B, that people had been responding by resisting different forms of violence. So I kind of came upon that reality accidentally at first, interviewing people who'd been subjected to many different forms of violence, and some women who'd been abused by their partners, typically their male partners, and adults who'd been abused as kids, armed robbery victims, so on and so forth, and also Indigenous people who'd been violated in the context of the prison camps, the ethnic cleansing camps that are euphemistically called residential schools. So I first started to hear about that accidentally, and I think it's because I started to focus in more detail on social interaction. So often when violence is discussed, the first question or important sets of questions, that's my alarm telling me to get up so you and I can talk. So the first set of questions becomes about how did that affect you, or how did that impact you, or that kind of a thing. And so in a very interesting, quick way, those kinds of questions move away from the event to its aftermath. And they don't ask about what people did or how they responded. They ask a very different kind of question. So that had been more or less my training too, like I think most people in the field. But when I started to focus on social interaction, something different began to happen in the conversation. So when someone would say, well, this guy sort of, suddenly approached me and told me to give him my purse, and then in the context of a robbery, then I'd be more likely to ask the question, think about that as an interaction. One person's trying to rob another. And if you're looking at it interactionally, then you want to know, well, what did the victimized person do? How did they respond? What happened? So I started to ask those questions. And immediately you begin to ask those questions. Number one, they're new to the person typically. They haven't really necessarily been asked that question before. But once they begin to think about it and say, well, I backed up and I thought, okay, I'm going to have to memorize this guy because I'm going to have to give a description later. So people will begin to describe things that they did, that ways in which they responded that can become understandable as forms of resistance. And so that was really the first step into that kind of way of thinking and working for myself. And of course, many other people have been there before before me. And so one of the people I started reading right after that was Liz Kelly, the English feminist sociologist, but also James Scott, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. And then, Frederick Douglass, the memoir of the well-known American slave who describes extraordinary acts of resistance throughout his life. And then the more you read in the memoirs and the literature of people who've been violated, oppressed, the more you read, the more you come to realize and see, because people tell you how they'd responded and how they'd resisted. So I went from never having talked about that or even thought about it, thanks to my training largely,
Yeah.
and thanks to my relatively privileged life, not having to think about those things or face those things, to suddenly beginning to sort of trying to understand that actually resistance to violence is ever present. Where there's violence, there is resistance. It's simply concealed. And then you begin to think about, well, why would it be concealed? How would it be concealed? And then that leads down the track of, I think, another set of important questions.
Yeah, and just to pause for a moment there, do you want to say a little bit about how you bring that up with people? Because I've noticed too, sometimes with children as well, that when you ask them, well, what did you do? They think you mean, well, what did you like to deserve it? Or what did you do
All
to
right.
provoke it?
Yeah.
And I have to ask in a really gentle way with, that curiosity and, wow, so what did you do next? How do you do that without making the person feel like you're asking them if they resisted? Because they'll say, I didn't resist, I couldn't, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's that tone that you mentioned of curiosity and legitimate curiosity, because of course you don't know what people did or what they made of the events at the time, or how they interpreted what was happening, or what else they might have been aware of in the back of their mind, or who else was in the situation that they might have been thinking of, or what have you. You simply don't know those things. So knowing that you don't know is a good place to begin.
Yeah.
And then having that, not a question about, oh, how did you resist, but I often will say, gosh, that sounds horrible. I mean, where were you at the time? Or was anyone else around? Or so I begin to kind of create a bit of an image of the scene, as
Yeah.
it were.
Mm-hmm.
Who's around, and then begin to ask, so okay, so when he did that, when you could see that he was getting really, really worked up, do you mind if I ask, how did you respond at that moment? Do you remember? Like, what did you actually do?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And so then you kind of move into the event in a slow and safe way by getting a picture of it. And then you depending on their age and what they're telling you and how well you know them and safety and everything else, then you can begin to ask that question and it's ordinary language, it's soft, it's gentle, and it's about social interaction or about other ways the person responded. So you can ask, oh gosh, so do you remember, how did you actually respond in that moment? Do you remember, like, what was going through your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Or, do you remember, like, what was your body saying to you in that moment?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you remember, like, how did you know this was really dangerous and it was going to get worse? And so then you begin tapping into kind of the pre-existing ability or competency or agency of the person,
Mm-hmm.
rather than sort of introducing categories like effects and impacts and so forth.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's funny to think about. We used to call it like we got reptile vibes, and kids will say, I got my spidey sense. Like you can
Yeah.
detect when something's kind of creepy or not right, hey?
Yeah. And then there are some really interesting, I mean, at first, you can kind of notice there are responses, and many of these responses are forms of resistance. But many of the things that we would now call, you and I and our colleagues and lots of other folks now, that we would think about as forms of resistance, have been called negative effects or impacts for a long period of time. So one example would be being really terrified or being really sad. That being sad is often seen as something else, like depression, or being really terrified is seen as anxiety. And these things are often talked about as effects or impacts of violence. But if you ask questions about, wow, how did you know to be sad?
Nice.
How did you know to be afraid? That was very clever, to be afraid. How did you know that you needed to be afraid in that moment? Then these, you know, powerful and often negative in the sense of painful, worrisome forms of suffering become understandable as um, competent responses, perceptive, meaningful,
Hmm.
not as negative end states to be treated and removed, but capacities inherent to the person that need to be honored and supported. So that sadness in response to extreme sadness in response to violence is, as we say, often a symptom of mental wellness. Something to be understood as meaningful, not as a negative end state to be eradicated.
Yeah, so much is linked to dignity. Eh? I remember as a child too, this thing of extracting remorse. So if you were getting a spanking, which is illegal now, but if you
Uh,
said, "Oh, that doesn't hurt," you'd get more. But if you started crying, they would stop. So
yeah.
it's like, how did you know to cry? Well, I knew that my dad would stop if
Mm,
I started to cry and say I'm sorry. Like
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
thoughtful.
And there,
Yeah.
exactly. And then there's the, we have, like you're pointing out, we have this experience of emotion, let's say. We might feel really terrified, but then you can ask, so he pointed the gun at you, and gosh, that must have been, what was that like? Oh, I was totally terrified. I thought he was going to kill me.
Yeah.
Right. And so did you let him know that you were terrified? Oh, God, no.
Yeah.
But then you begin to see that people have emotions,
Mhm.
very powerful emotions, and also often make tactical decisions about what to show or what not to show.
Yeah.
So again, that's social interactional. It's not only physiological or psychological. So even when people are having profound feelings, as you pointing out, they're just, again, I'm awake, honest. Even when you're
Hey, you're woke, man.
I'm woke. Even when people are having very profound internal psychological, physiological, spiritual experiences, people are also often, even kids, are making decisions about how much of that to show
Mhm.
and in what kind of a way.
Yeah, it's like the children in the prison camps, the stories of them saying, "Don't cry." When they hit you,
Mhm.
don't cry. Like the children saying that to one another because they don't want to give their tears away to their
Yeah,
abusers, right? It's something.
yeah. We're mindful. I think often what happens is that people who live with violence and unpredictability often are forced to become mindful of the consequences of every little action.
Yeah.
If you live in relative comfort and privilege and safety, you don't have to always be thinking about, okay, well, if I tell dad I'm hungry, what's he going to do? Or if I ask for whatever, I don't have to think about the consequences of even apparently innocent actions. But for many people who live with a high degree of unpredictability and violence, you really have to think about, if I do this, then what? What are they going to say? What are they going to do? Will it be all right? Will it be safe enough?
Yeah.
And so when you're forced to have that kind of awareness in circumstances, I think it's not that it becomes second nature, but it's kind of like a constant consideration.
Yeah, like even deciding whether or not you should make eye contact with your tormentor. Will that
Totally.
get you a hit across the face, or
Yeah.
is it better just to keep doing the dishes and looking down, right? All those decisions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that they are decisions, even if they become so routinized and habitual, because the person understands over time. It's like Czeslaw Milosz in the book called The Captive Mind. He wrote about how living under Stalin, every uh, every action was examined publicly for its relationship to the regime. So your choice of necktie, who you talked to, how you talked, every gesture was examined for the extent of its loyalty, or what else it might mean. And so he pointed out that in those circumstances, you're required to engage in acting all the time. And that kind of acting continuously is psychologically exhausting.
Mhm.
So one of the things you may have to do is adjust your thinking. That is, sort of enter yourself into a role so that you're in this role or in this way of being, so that you can kind of carry out what you have to carry out, carry off the appearance that you
Mhm.
have to carry off without having to constantly think about it. It was interesting. Patricia Hearst said something like that
Mhm.
in the context of the kidnapping and torture by the members of the SLA that she experienced. And of course, she's one of the most radically misunderstood humans, I
Right.
think, on the planet. But one of the things that she said was that after being raped and beaten and threatened, and they said to her, "Yeah, look, we're considering either you coming with us and joining us, or we kill you. So
Mhm.
you better think about that."
Yeah.
But she said at that point she realized, I had to adjust my thinking to theirs.
Mhm.
Basically, I had to make their way of thinking my way of thinking in order to pull it off. And I think for many people that can become part of what you have to do when you're present to the people who are harming you virtually all the time.
Yeah, and like you say, that can be so misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
especially by people that live in relative ease. But one example that you could comment on is how a woman will interact with her tormentor if she knows that children are in earshot,
Mm-hmm.
and how that's different if there's not a child or someone else they need to protect in the house, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I don't want the children to hear me being raped. I don't want him to be yelling at, I don't want, to talk to him about certain things that the children may have done or not done, because I don't want him getting angry at them, and also coaching the children and trying to help them be safe and understand the circumstances. And sometimes, unfortunately, that gets understood as being not protective or being brainwashed, to use the language of the Stockholm syndrome, or having internalized the oppression, or having, sort of subjugated yourself to your tormentor, when for many people it's precisely the opposite, really.
Hmm.
You have to be so clandestine, so tactical about the things that you're doing to create some level of safety, at least maximize the level of safety that might be there, so as to protect yourself and other people. And that's in circumstances of ongoing violence and oppression, where the offender is present to the victim virtually all of the time.
Yeah.
That becomes, I think, as you're pointing out, a really important thing to think about. How has this person managed the constant presence of a person who's a danger to them and their kids? How do they manage the unpredictability?
Hmm.
How do they manage the isolation? How do they, as we wrote a number of years ago, so the responses of and resistance of the victim are always relative to both the strategies of the perpetrator and the actual and possible social responses they might receive or have received.
Hmm.
So, for example, you know, the offender has been isolating you, driving you away from family and friends, and doing their best to humiliate you. So then, how do you preserve your dignity and endeavor to retain some contact with people who are meaningful to you and can help you? And then if some of those people have somehow got the idea that you choose abusive guys or whatever it might be, how is it that you find people to retain connections to who don't blame you? And so that has implications for the forms of your resistance. And so when you have people who will support you, certain responses are viable, that may not be viable when you have people that don't support you. And then the strategies of the perpetrator are always relative to those things. So they're complex circumstances. And
Yeah.
asking about social responses often before we even learn
Hmm.
about how people have actually responded and resisted could be really helpful. So I find myself doing that increasingly, asking the beginning of interviews about, oh, okay, so your partner was, this is not the first time, this is the second time child protection has been involved in your life. And so uh I mean, who was the first person you told about this happening? How did they find out? How did that go down? What happened? um and then you're trying to figure out, did the person feel supported and understood and listened to?
Mhm.
And did they feel they had some sense of autonomy, or were they blamed? Were they told they were not a non-protective mother? And then what implications did that have for how they responded to the perpetrator from then on? Or how did that influence how they responded to service providers the next time?
Right.
Then you can begin to understand, if you have that background of social network and institutional responses, then you can ask more sort of better aimed questions
Mhm.
to try and get at the nuance of their responses.
I hope you found this video informative. To watch the full-length version, consider subscribing to my Substack account by clicking the link in the description, where I will be sharing interviews, publications, and lectures related to counseling, social work, and Indigenous knowledges.